Okay, so welcome everyone to our last meeting of Empowering Adult Online Learning at Harvard University Extension School. I am Dr. Kim Round, and joining me tonight is Peter Shea, who has been my teaching assistant throughout the semester, and an amazing panel of thought leaders in the education. This class is made up of learners from all over the world, and they have spent the last 15 weeks in this COVID environment exploring adult learning theory, best practices in online learning design, and really an essential question. And that essential question being, what kinds of things might persist? What are the great learnings that we have had from, as Peter Shea has called it, the great online migration? And what things have been more challenging, and what items may be more temporary as we go forward and look at the future. So anyway, Peter, I'm going to toss this over to you and let you introduce our panel.
Thank you, Kim. Good evening, students. As Kim and I indicated before, what we wanted to do with you on this final evening is, to the best of our ability, bring together thought leaders who represent a real 360 about what's going on in the world of adult learning, both in academia and in workforce learning. And I think tonight we have been successful beyond our wildest dreams. Our panelists tonight are Allison Hall, who's Director of Learning Experience Design at Arizona State University, John McCormick, who is Associate Director of Learning Design at Brandeis University, Jennifer Morrisette, Assistant Director of Learning Experience Design and Effectiveness at Louisiana State University, Bernard Bull, President of Goddard College, Julie Dirksen, author of Design for How People Learn, which for many of us treat as the Bible of the ID field, Michael Feldstein, Chief Accountability Officer at e-Literate and co-founder of the self-promoted EdTech startup, an all-around guru in terms of where EdTech is going, and generally someone we go to quote in order to sound smart. So I think I've covered it all. Thank you again, everyone, for coming. We are so grateful. We're going to start with our series of questions put together from our students, with Kim leading for a few series of questions, and then I will lead, and then we'll go back to Kim. The questions we pose will not be posed to everyone for this. In the interest of time, we have selected a few people to respond to each question. But when those speakers are done, if there's anyone on the panel who feels the need to add or ask a question of their fellow panelists, please do so. Thank you. And I pass the ball back to Kim.
Great, thanks so much, Peter. So again, we have a wide variety of thought leaders in our session tonight, and each has chosen a pathway unique to their talents and interests. And for many of us in this field, our learners who are joining us, our panelists, this work is truly more than a job. It's really a vocation. And I'm very interested, and I know that our learners will be, if we could go around the panel and describe what drew you to your specific role as an educator, what gets you revved up to start your day. And if I can, I will start with Allison, if I can pick on you first. If you could lead us off, that would be absolutely wonderful.
Happy to. So what brought me to my role and what gets me up in the morning?
Absolutely.
All right. So,
and it may be good, Allison, too, or for our panelists to reiterate what their role is and what they do.
Absolutely. So Allison Hall, Director of Learning Experience Design at Arizona State. And what brought me to this role and what gets me up in the morning is is learning and the potential impacts it has on society, on people, to bring us together and make us better than we started off. I began in K-12. I taught kindergarten through 9th grade music and band before getting into the EdTech world and coming to ASU. And so, you know, seeing that span from, you know, K through lifetime, as a, you know, ASU, we're all about the lifelong learners. You know, it's all about, you know, for me, those connections, connections with each other, connections with curriculum, connections with where we're going and what the future really has to hold as a society. So is that a good kickoff?
Allison, you know, you got picked on first, and boy, you started us off in a great way. And Arizona State University, such an amazing institution. Lev Goddard, is he part of your organization, Learning Experience Design?
Yes, we report to him. Lev is the CIO. And so we are placed within the University Technology Office, which is kind of an odd, you know, place for learning design. But it speaks to his vision of, you know, how technology can help support the learning, and having those connections is really core to any technology that's happening in the school system.
Well, and the chief architects of the Learning Human Conference too. So
Yes,
anyway.
absolutely. And we have the Winter Games coming up in January. Come join us.
Oh, amazing, amazing. Thank you for that reminder. We'll be on the lookout for it. Okay, John, love to hear from you and your role at Brandeis University.
Hi, thanks. Yeah, so I'm the Associate Director of Learning Design. I'm not that far removed from, you know, being just a garden variety learning designer. I still work, you know, every week with instructors myself. What drew me to this? I'm probably like a lot of people in my field. I started out from a different route. I was a geologist. And I came to a point in my career where I wasn't really happy and I was looking for something more satisfying. And I just decided I wanted to help people learn something basic. And I started to teach English as a second language, went back to school a little bit around that. Started doing that. I did that for 8 or 9 years in the Seattle area in community colleges, and they have a great community college system there. And then honestly, I went back to graduate school and I thought there's something that I don't know that's important to teaching. And it looks like maybe it's this, you know, instructional design, instructional technology stuff. So around 2000, I went to school at the University of Washington, Seattle to learn about that. And what gets me excited every day, I like new problems, new challenges, and, you know, always with the learners in mind. Helping them with these things, helping instructors with some challenges. That's really it.
That's wonderful, John. Thank you so much. And I have lots of friends over at Brandeis, and I'm a faculty member there as well. And so respect your team and all that you do. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Jennifer, can we go to you next?
Hi, yes. So my current role, I'm Assistant Director of Learning Experience Design, Resources and Effectiveness. So it's a little bit of a different spin. This is at LSU, Louisiana State University. A different spin in that my main focus is more on the processes and tools and the resources that our design team use in order to implement the online course design with our online programs. Kind of like John, I guess my background a little bit different. My undergrad and my master's are in horticulture, kind of totally random, right? So, but I think it's really interesting. What we're seeing more and more is that, you know, how people find their path to instructional design. They often don't start off on the path, you know, intending to get to instructional design in that way. So when I finished my master's, actually, my professor in horticulture was applying for a USDA higher ed challenge grant with 3 other universities to implement, and then they got it. It's an alliance. It's called Alliance for Cooperative Course Exchange in Plant Sciences. And that was between LSU, Mississippi State, Oklahoma State, and University of Arkansas. And that was to do a course exchange of online courses, because at that time, and this was back in 2009, there was a lot of budget cuts at the university. We were losing faculty and from retirement, not being able to hire new faculty. And so in order to sustain the curriculum for students, we would do a course exchange in that way. And it's still going on now. So I started off helping to design the online courses, and kind of half subject matter expert, half learning to do this online thing when there wasn't really much support at the university for that at the time. So I very much kind of boots on the ground, learn as I went. And then my passion grew from there. Ended up pursuing Ph.D. and that's where I'm at now.
Such a great illustration of how people come to this discipline, Jennifer, right? As we're listening, that we don't necessarily start out with an education degree or multiple pathways. That's fabulous. Bernard, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and love to get your take on the question. You've had a lot on your plate this year.
Sure. So I'm currently serving as president of Goddard College, one of the original progressive experimental education schools in the United States, the first low residency, the founder of the low residency program in the US, launched all the way back in the 1960s. I come from a learning design technology, instructional technology background. So I'm probably one of the only presidents on the planet who comes from that background. It's not a common career path to go from instructional design to college president. And my work, what drew me to my specific role, I never sought to be a college president. And by the way, I'm president here. I'm also president-elect of Concordia University, Nebraska. I'll be moving there in 8 months, which is a very different kind of liberal arts institution. That was just announced 5 days ago. For me, my research and interests for the last 20 plus years have been an intersection of 4 distinct but related areas: experimental models of education and experiential or experimental models of education, K-12 and higher ed, innovation studies, specifically within the context of the education sector, not just K-12 and higher ed, but also workforce development and other kind of context. Futures in education and future studies, forecasting, trend analysis. And then a 4th one is the intersection of education and digital culture. And so that reading has brought me to a lot of different places. I started kind of connecting with people through actually just putting my work out there on the web, blogging and other things like that. And before I knew it, I started taking on a lot of consulting gigs for think tanks and other kinds of groups out there, and working for like Markle, a economic task force at Manhattan-based think tank, and some other groups, just doing consulting for publishing houses. I all along have been inspired by experimental schools that don't use letter grades or desks or rows, and they're sort of outside the box. And so there's a book called To Know for Real that is a vision of this radical school launched in response to the growth of fascism in the West back in the 1930s, with the goal of creating a place where learner voice, choice, ownership, and agency are central to what they do. No courses, professors don't have ranks, very different. And that book had inspired my research for years and years. I was on sabbatical at Wesleyan University writing a book on self-directed learning when I found that there was a presidency there. I applied for fun, out of curiosity, only to find myself as a finalist, and then to discover the college was on the brink of closure, multi-million-dollar deficit, put on probation by the regional accreditors. And then I really wanted the job because I just didn't want to see the place disappear. So for me, my getting up in the morning has been very clear. A month and a half ago, we successfully got off of probation and had a 10-year renewal of accreditation, or operating from a balanced budget, and still fragile, but it's been an incredible journey. So that's what gets me up in the morning, is really trying to champion and celebrate learning environments that believe in creating a more hopeful, humane, inspiring, and educational ecosystem. And that humane word is really big for me. It'll probably come up in conversation, in part of the conversation later. I come from a very interdisciplinary perspective on this, and the humanities very much inform my work as much as the learning sciences.
Bernard, amazing and so generous of you to come and spend time with us tonight. And as I'm listening, I'm thinking to myself, you're one of us, and but you also have that high-level strategic perspective and how this works at such a high level. And so we're looking forward to hearing that tonight. Thank you so much. So from here, let's go to Julie Dirksen. Julie, your name came up in a meeting that I was in just a few days ago. I work at, my full-time gig is at Western Governors University. I'm designing a new program there. And I've got to say that you have a fan base amongst the WGU
Oh, wow.
designers.
All right, that's good to know. Well, WGU does all sorts of interesting stuff. Oh, go ahead.
Say my cool factor went up about, 1,000 degrees when I mentioned that you were coming to class.
Oh, great. Yeah, so it's fun to hear everybody's kind of origin stories with different sorts of things, because I think I've got a few of those elements as well. I started out in workplace learning, so and actually I did a little bit of ESL stuff too, but I always say I'm an instructional designer because I'm happy as long as I get to learn something new, and it turns out it doesn't matter that much what it is. I just like knowing how things work. And so for the last probably 10, 15 years, a lot of what I try to understand how it works is actual learning design, instructional design. How do you take what you learn? When I was in graduate school, we did analysis and then we did design, but there wasn't very much that kind of connected the dots between those two boxes. So if you found this out in analysis, it should lead to this kind of design work. And the other big thing that I found is once you move outside of K-12, there aren't that many people who are trained teachers who get a lot of training on how to teach things. And so you have what I sort of refer to as, hey, you're a domain expert. We're going to let you teach other people your domain expertise, whatever that might be. It could be customer service or web design or geology or whatever. It could be any of these kinds of things. And that a lot of those people were put in the position of sort of faking it till they make it in terms of the learning design piece, because they knew their subject incredibly well, but they didn't necessarily have a lot of background for how do you teach that to somebody else. And so that was the impetus behind Design for How People Learn, was to give people a quick and accessible way to kind of wrap their heads around some of the basic principles that they were going to need in order to be successful at teaching something to somebody else. Because a lot of instructional design books, much as I love that stuff and I'm super nerdy about it, are a little bit dense and academic sometimes, and maybe not accessible to people for whom their domain expertise is in a completely different field. So trying to figure out, how do I take some of these ideas and make it so that I can kind of grant people a few quick learning superpowers to help them do the thing they need to do, because in both corporate workplace and in higher ed, there's a lot of people, they know their topic really well, but how to teach it is a whole different issue.
Absolutely. Well, Julie, thank you. We're excited to hear from you tonight. Thanks for joining us. Michael Feldstein, thank you so much. I'd love to hear your answer to this question, and take it away.
Well, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed listening to the stories of my colleagues. I love how uh, non-linear they are, right? And I think there's some important lessons there as we think about designing for the future of work. If we had all designed for the jobs that we have now, well, they didn't exist back then, and I'm not sure I could have imagined my job back then. I'm not sure I can describe my job to you now, really. I am mainly known for my voice. I have a blog. It has made wonderful things happen for me just by putting my thoughts out on the internet. And so you all, I'm going to try to focus rather on my story, more on the lessons that I've learned that may be relevant. So that's one of them. You all likely have something important to say to the world. You may not know what it is yet, but I have a couple of companies. That's not what I ever thought I would do. I try to knit together parts of the ecosystem. Going back to the beginning, I think of myself as a teacher from a family of teachers. Both my parents, both my sisters are lifelong educators. It never really occurred to me that I would do anything other than education. It was the family business. I started teaching middle school and high school. I have a theory that good teachers in K through 12 teach best the age at which their own emotional development was arrested. Mine was 8th grade, 13 years old. Loved that. My father was a principal. My principal at the school I taught with was also excellent. And the lesson I learned from them was that uh, supporting good teachers, enabling good teachers, helping teachers find their skills and unlock them, that's an important and honorable profession. So as you think about what your role is in the world, I hope that you'll consider the value of that. I was always interested in technology as a hobby. I went to graduate school for a little while, ended up doing corporate training and development, e-learning and knowledge management, basically. And that was fascinating because teaching with technology really made me take many of the pedagogical techniques that I was using instinctively in the classroom and really analyze them and break them down and think about them. I couldn't take them for granted anymore when I was designing remotely for what was at that time largely self-paced e-learning. But I eventually longed for core education again. So I made my way to higher ed, first working at the SUNY system in what was then called the SUNY Learning Network, and later for some vendors, and then doing consulting and on this whole path, and all the time writing. As a couple of my colleagues have mentioned, you discover in higher ed that most professors are teaching by instinct because that's all anyone's ever shown them. And so one of the things that I love about educational technology in higher education is that I get to help other educators go through the journey that I did, which is being in a situation in which they have to unpack and make explicit their tacit knowledge about teaching, and to see what they do well and to question what they think they do well, and learn what they could be doing well. So I don't know if that story makes much sense. My father still doesn't understand what I do. He asks me at least once a month, and I'm afraid I'm not very good at explaining it, but hopefully there was something of value in there.
Michael, that was incredibly valuable, especially we've actually had that conversation where we've tried to explain to our family members what we do and our friends. Last but not least is the incredible Lori Niles Hoffman. And Lori, thank you for joining us tonight, and take it away.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's incredible to be around such esteemed company, and I'm looking forward to hearing everybody talk. So, Lori Niles Hoffman, you'll notice from my accent, I'm a little further north from you. So I'm located in Toronto, Canada, a very snowy Toronto, Canada. I got into the industry when I graduated, when all of my peers were going to places like Japan or places that were warm to teach English as a second language. I thought, hey, wouldn't it be great to go to northern Poland, in fact, northern rural Poland, and teach English? Not a career move I would recommend, but I had an absolute blast when I was teaching English as a second language. And I actually got picked up by the University of Poznan to teach Intro to Lit. My parents were absolutely thrilled with that until I had to explain I was the only person who spoke English as a native language in 150 square kilometers. So really, I could have stood up and taught anything. So it wasn't the achievement maybe they thought it would be. Eventually ran through all of my money. It's not very lucrative being a lonely teacher in rural Poland. Came back to Canada, and I knew I wanted to stay in teaching, and so I ended up going into corporate education. So I was working with some of the banks here in Canada. Worked my way up to, through, and was an instructional designer, project manager, and then I really got into the EdTech. And I was implementing, multinational learning management systems, and then eventually LXPs for my sins. And I was at KPMG, and I had this great job, and I was so miserable. And I, in 2016, just said, I don't agree with anything we're doing. It's not working for the end user. I don't like this canned content. And if I see one more avatar, I'm just absolutely going to lose my mind. And so I quit, and I didn't have a job to go to. And I thought, well, what does one do when they have time? They write. So I started writing about something called data-driven learning design, which I just put out there as my little lowly ebook. And then I started blogging, because that's better than a martini at 4 p.m., which was what I was doing before I started blogging. And just started putting out all of my own ideas. And now I'm co-founder of Niles Nolan. I have a business partner who lives in Madrid. And we help Fortune 500 companies on their EdTech strategy. So I've moved away from the instructional design, the actual learning experience design, more about the architecture that facilitates it, primarily how data is used to inform and enhance those environments. And we also work on things like how you make the business case for the transformation. What's your new target operating model? What are the new skills L&D needs? And it's been a blast.
Amazing, Lori. Well, we've got quite a few questions about how we leverage data in this new paradigm. So that's going to be amazing to get your perspective. So thank you. Thanks again to our panel. And we are going to move into the questions section that our students have architected. And just a reminder to our learners tonight that you may not hear your question asked exactly how you wrote it. What happened was we took all of the questions and consolidated them into themes. So you'll hear your question, but probably part of a different prompt. So listen carefully. So this first discussion prompt is from Michael, Bernard, and John. And we're going to start with our essential question this semester that we have all been talking about. From your perspective, what are the future trends and positive shifts that we expect to see due to COVID in online learning? And what are some of the more negative ones? And so what changes do you think will be more temporary? And so Bernard, if you wouldn't mind, I would love to start with your thoughts.
Thank you. So in my work in future studies, I do a lot of scenario planning so that I'm exploring possible futures. And in the process, there are really multiple kinds of futurists. There are those that are kind of your game theorists, hardcore, analysis of the data and so forth. And you don't even have to know what you're talking about. The numbers can actually tell you what's going to happen without even knowing what you're discussing in some ways. There are those that are more interdisciplinary that look at sort of lots of different fields and approaches. And from that, you try to create a narrative and make some projections on where things are going. And then there are also the activist futurists who are the ones who do some of those other two things, but they don't try to bracket their own biases and assumptions. They openly embrace the fact that they want to not only figure out where things are likely to go, but actually shape the direction in a way that they hope it goes. And so my response is actually going to be on the activist side a little bit here to that. Sorry for all of that background. So I would say that one of the concerns about remote learning and then online learning conversation amid COVID that I've been delighted to see is the heightened concern around what it means to have relationship in digital and virtual spaces. A lot of the K-12 educators, if you interview people and you talk about why you went into education, you find some who went into it because of a great passion for the discipline alone, but many actually come from a place of a real passion for transforming the lives of people, its relationship, and being there to support people in their learning journeys and having the honor of watching them as they grow and discover. And that's not uncommon as well in other spaces, And so one of the pieces that's come up is a sense of loss in this space, of a loss of the personal connection that one knew how to conjure or create or to nurture or facilitate within an in-person environment. And they found themselves with this set of resources, environments, tools that they'd never really experienced. So we have, and even though some of us who've been studying this, we could take them back to the 1990s for online learning and actually take them back 150 years to the distance learning movement and research and literature. Most weren't even tapping into that at all. I mean, they were given a Zoom account and told to teach or something like that. And at least in the K-12 space, but it happened in other environments, including in many workplace environments and small businesses and the like, and where they ended up going for professional development. So where I'm going with all of this is I'm really heartened by the highlighted the highlighted concern about the loss of the personal connection. I'm concerned, though, that maybe it doesn't go as deep as I hope it would. I really believe in the importance of not only creating learning environment, well, I'll say this, learning environment, you can design a learning environment or a learning experience that achieves its stated outcome. And the person has developed a new base of knowledge, or they've developed a new skill set, or whatever it is. And you can look at it and say that was a success. My work has largely been focused upon something that goes a little bit beyond that, or maybe a lot beyond that, so that we're trying to create environments or contexts where people are inspired, where there's a sense of inspiration or meaning or connection or purpose, a sense of adventure, that a sense of wonder or mystery that actually stays with them for a lifetime in some cases. The psychology of wonder is phenomenal because we know that a person can have a moment of wonder and they can recall with vivid recollection that moment 20 years later. How many learning environments are successful in doing that, right? How many learning experiences successfully and regularly repeat that kind of experience? And I'm really hopeful that this heightened conversation around relationship and humanness and humanization, that we're going to be able to ride that conversation beyond COVID. And that in a post-COVID context, even as people are thinking of finding ways to have hybrid and in-person, returning to in-person, I'm hoping that there will be a residue in the virtual space that drives us to embrace what it means to be deeply human in our learning experiences.
Thank you, Bernard.
A little
Amazing.
bit philosophical, but I use the metaphor often of oxygen. If you actually look at of a poorly designed learning environment and you describe the traits of the learner, and then you look up the physiological traits of someone experiencing hypoxia or oxygen deficiency, they're actually quite similar characteristics. I would argue that that's because when we design poor learning environments, we suck out the intellectual equivalent of oxygen from the air, the things that we as humans have craved from as far back as we have recorded history. The sense of mystery and wonder and adventure and connection and growth and purpose and meaning and all of those things. So I'm really hopeful that we can leverage this as a time to dive more deeply into those topics of the humanities.
Such amazing learning there, and such a great metaphor. Thinking about it in terms of hypoxia. I love that. I love that take, Bernard. Thank you. Michael, let me go to you next.
Yeah, I'd like to pick up a little bit on some of Bernard's comments about the sense of loss and the dislocation of educators and students alike in this switch to remote learning. I think it works both ways in terms of that learning environment. And I think another lesson that some educators have walked away with is, gee, I'm doing the same thing on Zoom that I did in class, and somehow the magic is not there. What's that about? Well, maybe the magic wasn't in your lecture. There is a magic that is wired into us genetically. If you put a group of humans physically in the same space for a period of time, and you create environments that are even dysfunctional, like 300-person lecture halls and ridiculous registration processes and all the kinds of crazy, poorly designed aspects of residential education, somehow magic is going to happen anyway. And what being in a hypoxic learning environment forces you to do is think about, where was that oxygen coming from in the first place? And so I think there is a lot of exploration. Faculty are finding that, in fact, they can make connections online. Some who would swear they would never, ever teach online are finding some value in it. I think others are starting to realize, wow, we have all these tools, but the way they connect really sucks. And I think, look, suckiness is a valuable indicator, right? This sense of deep dissatisfaction. We have these interoperability standards like LTI, which for the non-technical in the groups, I don't really know all your backgrounds, but it's the thing that lets you connect tools to an LMS. And it was wonderful. It was a revolution. It completely changed the learning environment. And it sucks. It's so much better than before, and it's still so inadequate, right? And we didn't even really think about our synchronous learning environments, because before now, online education was really focused on people who couldn't or didn't want to have a residential experience. So it was very much focused on access. I'm home, I've got, I'm working, I've got kids, I can get on here and there for a while, right? And that's one kind of learning experience, and it's important to have out there. But what we're learning now is that there is this whole range of digital that we haven't even thought about. And so I am optimistic that we are beginning to think about the digital residential education, what that would mean. And I also think we would be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about the economics. because campuses are under tremendous financial pressure. They already were. It was getting worse. COVID has accelerated that. We may or may not get major change with the new government. It's hard to tell. But we have learned a few fundamental lessons, which is, except for the top tier institutions, funding streams are getting less diversified. State institutions by and large are either holding steady or declining in funding. Grants are harder to come by. These dreams that we had, that first it was that there are 1 million people in China or India who would love to get a degree in turf grass management from middle of the road state college, if only it were online. That didn't pan out. Then there was the fantasy that there were so many people who want to pay $50,000 for an online master's in social work, and that sort of hit a wall. What we're discovering is that the best way for a lot of institutions to achieve sustainability is to reach the students within their geographical area of reach. And even online, when you can go to school anywhere in the world, most of your students are going to come from a 150-mile radius of your institution. It's weird, but that's the way it is, right? So you reach as many students as you can in that geographical area. You hold on to them, you get them to graduate, and you figure out a way to serve them well for 20 or 40 years instead of for 2 or 4 years. That's a very different kind of mission than a lot of institutions, particularly institutions that prided themselves as being residential college experiences, have thought about. So we have a lot of rewiring to do.
That makes that I love how you've touched on particularly what was the state of higher ed before we even went into this, that we were stressed to begin with. Thank you so much, Michael. John, you've been working with faculty that as they've been navigating this change. What are your takeaways so far?
Yeah, thanks. So what I've seen, I worked at Lesley University for 9 years, which is near Harvard University. It's a small, kind of liberal arts school. They have a lot of counseling, higher ed. And then I've only been for 6 months at Brandeis, which is sort of a research one institution. It's small. It has a lot going on. It's a very complex institution in terms of what they're trying to do. I guess what I've seen that resonates with what other people have said is there is a lot of empathy for students in both of those institutions from faculty standpoint. So there's this heightened concern about equity and inclusion, and there's more focus on the experience of learners. So that brings me some hope that, and I don't know where this is going. I've read, different people saying different things about predictions, but will it be a greater value or focus on teaching and learning in universities in the United States? Right, because as somebody I think said, that the talented amateur, that instructors are not, they're amateur in the sense that it's not a professionalized field for them, right? And at Brandeis is interesting because I'm in a graduate professional school where I'm working with faculty who are in the real world, and they're teaching graduate programs in things like robotic software and highly technical fields like analytics. And our group, which is a small learning design group, is being moved right now to the library, being centralized. I think that COVID was part of the, catalyst for that. I'm kind of hoping. And that so we're being centralized in this place called like the hub. And the library director, I've talked to him a few times, he seems to feel like the future at Brandeis at least is going to be, there'll be a number of instructors who won't go back to the old world. They want to go forward. And, they're mostly pretty much a face-to-face institution, but the idea of using the online environment to enhance the face-to-face, he feels is something that's there. So I was kind of hopeful that there's something that's really big in the library is they have several makers labs. and they have digital scholarship lab, they have a robotics lab, and it's hugely popular among students for project-based learning. And I was sort of submitting, well, why don't you do a sort of a teaching design lab, that's there for everyone, teaching learning lab, where we can work with instructors or whoever wants to on their projects with design tools and stuff like that. So I don't know.
I hear you. It's definitely moving. Thank you, John. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to move to the next question, and I'm going to Allison. I'd love to first start with you and get your thoughts. So we're beginning to see a disaggregation of education where learners can just take a just-in-time credential through Coursera and Udemy, potentially at a lower price. And from your perspective, how do you think this freedom of choice and flexible pathways, how do you think that'll impact the more traditional degree programs? And do you think that employers will actually distinguish between online degrees and certificates versus in person? I'm not sure that they do now, but love to get your thoughts on that.
That's an excellent question, and it's definitely, a barrier that pretty much every day in the news you can see it breaking down a little bit more. And I know it gives us all of our traditional higher ed friends some severe anxiety, but it really has to be about the people, and that's what the idea of these micro credentials, micro courses is how can we democratize education and get exactly what everyone needs to the person that needs it when they need it. And that's really core to ASU's heart of the lifelong learning. And you ask anyone about our charter, the number one thing is that we're measured not only by who we include, but if they succeed. And when you take it in those large traditional chunks, maybe it lowers the rate of possible success. It creates more barriers, and there's less opportunities for second chances or trying out new things. And our society and what we need is changing so rapidly. To wait for everything to go through the traditional processes, I mean, entire fields are going to be spun up and have expertise before it can get through a curriculum committee. No disrespect to the curriculum committees, they do very hard work. And so, yeah, those micro credentials and that segmentation of education into, integrating co-curriculars and those learning artifacts in with the traditional paradigms paints a more complete picture of us as learners and humans, and really empowers learners to be able to communicate that. We all grew up learning so many things, and I think it's reflected in our career trajectories where, a few of us started here, but we ended up here. And it's by all those little quirks along the pathway that might not have gotten recorded. And there are so many folks that, they do amazing things, but they don't know how to articulate it. They don't even know that they've done something amazing. When I left the classroom, one of the things I got a lot from my peers was, what makes you think you can do that? Like, you're a music teacher. What do you know about? You just use like some computers in your classroom. But it's all about, those little skills that add up and paint a completely different picture. So that's where I see that contributing to our future.
So it's in Arizona State, I imagine, is in a position to really look at those stackable opportunities and with micro credentials. And I know at WGU, that's very much part of our program architecture right now. Is
for sure.
A learner can come for a 2-course micro credential and then maybe come back in 6 months for a certificate, and then realize, I'm halfway through a degree. Why don't I finish it?
Yeah.
That's
yeah, because life happens. Life happens. You got to be able to go away and come back.
Right.
Explore new passions.
And walk away with something though, you know, that it's not that.
100%.
Yeah, absolutely. Bernard, you know, from your perspective, leading higher ed organizations, moving from Goddard and going to Concordia, and your thoughts around experimental education. Do you want to add some color to this?
Sure. So I probably wrote more informal articles on digital badges and micro-credentials than anyone on the planet when they kind of first came out. You know, I wrote hundreds of blog posts, just sort of getting my thoughts out there as I was making sense of it and trying to learn. I got disenfranchised by the badge movement and sort of backed away whenever, from my perception, it sort of had a bit of a corporate takeover. And I stepped back, although oddly enough, I maybe re-engaged again soon. You may hear about that. But what came from it for me was this opportunity to revisit what is it that gives meaning to a learning environment or learning context. And so I ended up going back to the 1970s literature when a term was popularized and even coined called credentialism. And credentialism is this notion that over time, the credential itself takes on a perceived value apart from what it indicates. So the example I give is you know, you're going to the hospital and all of a sudden you find this hospital sign and everyone pulls over and they just stop and they drop their sick off at the hospital sign. I mean, that does nothing for them. The sign is simply an indication of what is down the road. They have to get to the hospital in order to have actually learned something. I'm really encouraged by the open recognition movement, which has expanded the conversation a bit beyond just the open badge infrastructure, which has some value. And it's all a part of this kind of this piece, because as we think about the relationship between learning and workforce development or opportunities in workplaces, a key has to do with not just what have I learned, but how am I able to connect with other people who value what I've learned? Whether it's for a workplace opportunity or whether it is for connecting, networking for people who have a shared passion project. It could be for an impact we want to have in the community. I always say, you know, the digital world has made it possible for someone who lives in North Wisconsin and I've never seen an ocean to care about saving the whales and actually find their people, and they can, you know, connect around that. And so I'm really, where I'm really interested though, is what's going to happen. Higher education in the last couple of decades in particular, as one expression of adult learning, has tied itself very strongly to the credential. The diploma is still a key piece, even though we may use the discourse and say this is more about about so much more than the diploma. When you talk to people, I mean, having that piece of paper is a really big deal and it's central. I have a book. I was just talking to a publisher. Hopefully I have it sold, but it's a book that I'm working on called The Lincoln Test, which is based upon the premise of Abraham Lincoln having achieved all that he did without ever obtaining a formal academic credential at any point in his life, including not, never going to law school. So he was sort of this self-taught person. And the question is, how do we create a contemporary ecosystem where the Lincoln Test holds up, where people can truly be acknowledged, celebrated, and connected on the basis of their learning and not necessarily which credential exists to them. So I'm really hopeful about what kind of developments are happening. In the Obama administration, there were some fascinating early experiments that started happening around national job databases, where we were starting to do a textual analysis to begin to connect people with opportunities. I mentioned Markle before. They have a funded initiative in Colorado that's helping employers learn how to hire people on the basis of something other than just saying BA required, where they find some fascinating trends, like maybe someone who worked in a circus for 8 years would be perfect for HR, but they would have never gotten through the traditional screening processes. So I think we're coming into a really fascinating place where micro-credentials and big data and our capacity to analyze more than just numeric data, but doing sort of analysis of text and other kinds of metadata can intersect and create some really fascinating opportunities.
Fabulous, Bernard. I'm so excited about the connections that you're making too, and with the work around the skills work. with the workplace. I know we've been talking a little and partnering around a skills library at the government level, and that kind of speaks to a lot of what you're talking about with the Obama administration. So fabulous, thank you. I'm going to move on to a just kind of a quick follow-up question and then turn it over to Peter. Jennifer, I'm going to go to you next. And our students were interested in how might we plan for some of the long-term effects on learners due to their COVID experiences. And what might they be? What is missing? We've talked about the relational component. We've talked about the social component, the things that we miss a bit when we're not in physical proximity. Are there some value adds from your perspective, new skills that learners may be taking away from this time? Potentially digital literacy, some technology literacy. And from your perspective, what do you think this is going to mean way down the line in the hiring landscape? Are these going to be new skills, or are we going to have a talent gap? I know it's a big question, but definitely interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, so, I mean, the first thing actually that popped into my head when you were asking the question in terms of the COVID experience for students and what that might mean skill-wise in terms of higher ed and navigating that system and planning for that. I'm actually going to start by maybe taking the perspective of the higher ed side of it and how they can serve their learners for that particular type of situation. So for example, there might be opportunities for institutions to hire roles such as a concierge type role that will help the student navigate the system, right? Because a lot of times if you're in the classroom, you could be walking down the hall, you get to talk to your colleagues or walk into another professor's classroom and they tell you, oh, well, you go here for that, or don't worry about this, you need to go there, but there's so many barriers a lot of times if you're not there in person to kind of figure out where to go and what to do. And so I think there's an opportunity for sure for there to be a more service-driven support structure for students in a digital world, even outside of the design part of online. So that's number one. The flip side of that, though, is the students kind of digging a little bit deeper into their institution's resources because they have to dig themselves, right? So there's that side of it. But as far as a talent gap, can you clarify what you mean by that exactly in terms of like?
Sure. Well, our learners were thinking about, if later on down the line, are we anticipating or thinking through a little bit that because of the lack of in-person, those kind of coming of age experiences that our learners may have on college campuses or together with their professors, that potentially these lack of having these particular experiences, and I think Michael touched on this a bit too. What does that look like for us in the workplace? And Michael, feel free to jump in and add some color here too.
Yeah, I think on the one hand, I think we have a lot of thinking to do about re-architecting the experience. I agree with Jennifer that having a digital concierge for an online experience is a good idea, but it also suggests that the experience that we've translated into online is bad enough that you need a concierge to navigate it in many cases, right? I look at places like Georgia State, and some of the work they've done there has been amazing. And it's all about figuring out what barriers they threw up that they didn't even know existed. Like that, you know, they have a lot of students there. This is pre-COVID, right? They have a lot of students there right in the heart of Atlanta, Georgia, majority minority population of students and growing. Some of those students, you know, getting vaccinated is a barrier for them. They don't have anyone to help them with it. So they just set up, you know, mobile vaccination trucks. As students come in for class for the first time to register, they get vaccinated, right? So that's one thing. And I think the other thing, the question that you're asking, I think, Kimberly, is about, well, what do those students lose and how do we help them post-loss? And I guess I'm of two minds of that. I mean, on the one hand, I don't think it's healthy to overly focus on loss. We know of people who've gone through terrible tragedies, you know, been refugees, and they've found those experiences. Yeah, I think we can probably all think of experiences through this pandemic, as horrible as it's been, that have been incredibly moving and life-changing and made us think of the world in different ways. So maybe they're learning skills now that they wouldn't have if they had the cocoon of the university around them. At the same time, like all this talk about creative destruction and future work and jobs shifting, it's happening faster now. There are whole sectors of the economy that are dying right now, and whole other sectors that are exploding. And students may not know, you know, to Bernard's point, that they have transferable skills to areas that jobs they didn't even know existed, right? And that if we just give them a little bit of help, a little bit of a, you know, point in the right direction, maybe a few skills that they're missing to fill in, that they could have happy, healthy, exciting lives. But we have to get better at figuring out what those gaps are by working. I don't believe that education should be all about teaching students to get a job, but I think people need to earn a living. That's part of our responsibility. So we do need to work more closely with employers to figure out how to help students make the most of the experiences that they have and bridge those over into enriching, both physically and psychologically and spiritually, enriching experiences that they could have with just a little bit of help. And I don't have answers as to how we do that, but it's very clear that we need to be focused on it.
And you know, this is one of those questions that, as I was reading it from our learners, I thought, well, we're probably not going to be able to answer that one tonight, but we may be talking about our thought processes going forward and how we might think about that question. So Michael, Jennifer, thank you so much in helping us with this kind of solver question. And Peter, I'm going to turn it over to you. And there's a section of questions that are really more focused in on specifically adult online learning. And we'll get a little bit more granular. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Kim. Before I go into the questions, I have to jump back a bit to Bernard's observation about credentialism. And when he was speaking, I was inevitably reminded of one of my favorite critiques of higher education that comes at the end of The Wizard of Oz, when the wizard has to admit to the scarecrow that he can't actually give him brains, but he can give him something just as good, a diploma. And again, I think about, you know, that and the fact that someone can make a dry remark about that in 1939, before it even got as bad as it is today, which gives you some historical perspective on the problem. But I think we've certainly reached a saturation point, and where we need to move away from credentials to competencies. On the issue of the future of online learning, I have a couple of questions. And my first one I'm going to give first to Bernard and to Laura, because I wanted the academic and the workforce perspective. What knowledge and competencies should students who are preparing to enter the field of adult learning, who want to really be good and not be, as we said, talented amateurs, entering adult learning in either workforce learning or in academic learning, which they may not have learned from their own formal education, from own formal environments? What competencies should they be mindful of bringing to their work as learning professionals in these different fields? So we'll start with Bernard, and then we'll go to Lori.
I'll just start with two simple ones that we might not put under the category of competency, but they're traits. One is the humility to listen and learn and observe. There's this, I teach design thinking in doctoral, for a doctoral program. I teach design thinking in future studies and innovation studies. And one of the core traits that I'm just trying to nurture is just having listening. We talk about listening skills, but we all have these really deeply seated assumptions. We jump to assumptions and conclusions so quickly, oftentimes. And even when we're trying to bracket our assumptions, we find that they're shaping and coloring our assessments. And so to really cultivate this capacity to have a sort of a dispassionate position and really listen and observe and learn. That's part of what I appreciate about the design thinking movement, is the trait that it can cultivate in people who practice different expressions of design thinking, whether or not I know the different debates and perspectives on that design thinking itself. And I think the other piece is related to it is how does one cultivate curiosity? How do you put yourself in a posture of being deeply curious about something? I honestly believe that I could find rich meaning studying toll booths the rest of my life if I needed to. Because it has to do with sort of finding meaning and purpose in it. In fact, that's why I gravitate towards studying boring topics, like studying letter grades or credentials or things that aren't particularly sexy or exciting, because when you dive into them and you approach them from a posture of really deep curiosity, you start to surface all of these really fascinating things that everyone else just passes by. And I think those two traits, if one cultivates this humble listening and this capacity to place themselves in a position of being genuinely and deeply curious, those can take someone a very, very long way in almost any profession, but this one as well.
Thank you. Okay, over to Lori.
Okay, so I'm probably going to, I'm always known as the voice of bluntness. So I'm going to say the first 2 years that you come out of having been classically trained as, in adult, online education, adult learning theory and all that sort of stuff, your first 2 years in corporate are going to be hell. And the reason for that is because you're going to have all of this theory and you're going to, be really focused on, crafting everything around your learning objectives and all that. And you're going to come up against stakeholders who honestly, I'm sorry to say, and I'm saying this with love to you, don't care. And they're going to be very concerned with how do I get, person A to get competent in activity B, and you're going to need to learn to navigate around that. And I see that there's two types, is that you have some, who will really dig their heels in and, but I really, really want, my blooms, and have you heard of Gagne's, and, they want to have that conversation. And then the other ones who can navigate around it and learn that they have to speak business language. And that doesn't mean that you're diluting anything. You're not taking away from the instructional design, but you need to meet them where they are at, and don't get them all involved in the pieces that they don't need to see. So that's probably the one that I would say is usually the hardest when you come out come out of school and into corporate. The other things that I would really be looking at, data analytics. You're going to need that, and that's something that if you haven't delved into, I would suggest understanding some of that at the very basics. Understanding qualitative versus quantitative data. Those types of things are going to be important. Don't run off and have to do huge courses on Tableau and whatnot unless that's your jam. But that's going to be something that you're going to want to have. Another one that I know people hate hearing this, but marketing. And what I mean by that is marketing automation. That is not marketing your courses to people. It's understanding how, when you look at a pair of shoes online, it follows you from Facebook to Instagram to all these places. If you put that through the lens of paced, nudged learning theory, it actually is, you can make it very, very similar. So you need to understand those fundamentals. So I always recommend, start to delve into a little bit of our marketing automation and how digital really works for them. And the other thing that I would also say is you're going to learn to say no. Performance consulting is huge. And how do you navigate those conversations? If there's no evidence of need in corporate and people will come to you for every single thing that they want and believe that person should know, you've got to be prepared to say no. So I understand that my world is very different from a corporate sense, but it is, that's the lens that it's put through.
Thank you. And that's a wonderful segue into some of my next questions, which are around the impact of data and how they're going to be shaping the world of learning. So I'm going to pivot back to you, Lori, and I'm going to go to Julie. And my question for the both of you is this: how do you envision learning in a data-driven world? And remember, we've only got a few minutes here because I know you can do this for several years, probably.
I think it's best probably for me to describe it in terms of an experience. What the data is going to be is it's triangulating from all the different places where you are operating. And this is stuff that Microsoft is already aiming towards. If you look at their teams and if you look at how they are now structuring data and how they are, and they own LinkedIn Learning. So it'll come to a point where if you're in Teams and you're typing about project management, it may suck in something from LinkedIn Learning. I don't think that's great because I think that's actually context, that's lacking context. But what I think it'll be more about is to say, and I was using this example earlier with Kim and Peter, okay, you just finished level 4 Spanish. The next time you log into Excel, would you like to change your default settings to Spanish? Incorporating some of those things together. It's also about starting to understand what you're searching for and maybe where you have errors. So if you have a CRM, a customer relationship management system, if you're committing errors there, that starts to feed into or automatically triggers a campaign saying, hey, start looking at some of these things. So it's pooling all of those pieces into something that's very bespoke and has meaning and gives you opportunity to practice. That's a utopia, but we are getting closer to it. And if you look at even this is just Microsoft's, their latest advertising for the Surface tablet is marketed as a place to work, learn, and play. They're making a very, very big targeted effort towards that learn. And we'll see more of that. Over to you, Julie.
Yeah. When we look at it from a corporate point of view, I think one of the things that we need to really think very hard about is how are we getting better feedback on our efforts? And a lot of the stuff that Laura's doing with data-driven kinds of things is going to make a big difference on it. Honestly, it's a field that's been starved of real feedback for. I've been doing this for, I've been involved in educational technology on the corporate side for, I think 25 years. Sorry, I'm gonna get my numbers wrong, but about 25 years. And I would tell you that like the amount of actual information you get about what you're doing in terms of what's working and what's not working is not gotten any better in that time frame, and in fact possibly gotten worse. So Michael was talking about the LTI thing. I SCORM on the corporate side is no better than that. Somewhere somebody decided way back when that the only things we needed to know about what our learners were doing in an online learning environment on the corporate side was, did they finish it? How much time were I on the page? And did they pass the test? Which is like peering at your learners through a drinking straw. There's no data there. So I'm excited about that, but I'm also a little bit wary about it too, because Bernard was talking about humane design. And one of the issues with the data-driven is that we've seen it get misused as well. And the potential for misuse is huge. I often use the Wells Fargo example where they wound up with a massive amount of, kind of fraudulent signups for their customers because they had a very data structured thing for their customer service reps where they had to cross-sell products. And because the burden on those people was so enormous, the only way that they could keep their numbers up to the data standards that were helping us gauge performance was to sign people up without their permission, basically. And so kind of all of these issues start to play in together. We're going to get more feedback, we're going to have more data, but how do we also make sure that we're using that in a way that is responsible and true to some, true to some of our bigger values.
And to add to that really quickly, Julie, I also, we're eventually going to come into a GDPR of employee data. If you think about it, you're online at 8 p.m. and you're taking a course that's your own personal development, et cetera. Who owns that data? And if it's on your own device, but yet you're accessing a corporate course that they've paid for the subscription for, do they get to know your test score on that if it's not directly linked to a compliance-based learning? There's a lot of ethics that I think need to be thought out about what we're tracking about employees and what we're triangulating against their HR data or personal data, and it gets very dangerous.
Excellent point. Thank you. My next question is about scale and sustainability. And so I'm going to direct it to Jennifer and Allison, given their experience in building programs. So here's the question, and we'll start with Jennifer, and then we'll go to Allison. How do we scale and sustain innovative learning design? Obviously, you both had extensive experience in this, so it seems the perfect thing to ask you. So we'll start with Jennifer, and we'll go to Allison.
So when we're talking about scale, from managing like a design team perspective, I think initially the reaction might be to want to make everything super prescriptive because it would be much simpler to manage something than when everything is the same, right? But what we see in practice is that people are human, people do things differently and want to work on things in a different way, particularly between the dynamic of an instructional designer and a faculty member. And so the other thing that needs to be considered when you're scaling with the human side of that is understanding the context in which you're working with and understanding the context of your partner, being that may be the faculty member as a subject matter expert. So the simpler thing would be to scale design principles, scale certain types of templates that have flexibility, right? And not so much make it a step-by-step, we're gonna lockstep move from A to B to C to D. It can be much more dynamic and cyclical as long as there's milestones there that we can track to. Because in practice too, even in higher ed, and Peter, you can speak to this a little bit too, we very much project manage these things. So, and we're working on a timetable to launch a particular online program, let alone just when the courses need to go live for the semester or the term, right? So there's a lot of dynamics that go into that relationship when we're talking about scale. And so I do think that focusing on those design principles, milestones, not so much a step-by-step process is going to get you farther, faster.
Thank you.
Agree. Well said, Jennifer. And to build on that, so, I think it's Todd Rose has a book, The End of Average, and it talks about how, when we design for the middle, we meet no one's needs. And that's, one of those enemies of scale that's been longstanding is, to templatize the wrong things. And so by templatizing those, the theories, the thought process, what the underlying structure is, it allows for more flexibility and personalization. And so one of the things that we really use for that is to leverage the community and the communities of practice, and make everyone a creator. One of the other enemies of scale, I'll call them, are those traditional roles of this is what everyone does and they only do this little thing. But the fact is, when you open that box up and integrate, the faculty, the students, your customers, maybe I'm dabbling into Lori's realm too much. I might be misspeaking. I don't have a corporate background, but but by bringing in those folks that are not, traditionally involved, they can be additional builders to help you scale up and spread good practice in the way you want to see it happen. So yeah, I think, those, sticking too close to these traditional design things will fight against that ability to scale. So yeah, great job, Jennifer. I'm just adding on.
I think you both did a great job. So, going back a little bit to combining the data early question and the question about systems and scalability. My next question is going to go to Michael and Lori, and it will be, what best practices would you advise to get organizations to adapt a more data-informed EdTech ecosystem, and one that obviously takes into account some of the problems and challenges and ethical dilemmas that we've brought up in the conversation? So, Michael, start with you.
Yeah, I've loved the last handful of answers. There's so much in there to synthesize to address your question. One thing I heard from Jennifer, we have this notion of scale that it just evokes these 19th century factory notions, and we don't have to think about scaling that way. What Jennifer basically said, my interpretation, forgive me if I'm mischaracterizing you, Jennifer, but what I heard was that culture and literacy scale, right? You teach your stakeholders, your educators, your other team members about principles, design principles. You develop a culture in which that matters, in which, looking at your results and figuring out what worked and looking at evidence from other studies, like that's part of their professional identity. That scales. And so one of the gigs that I have that I won't go into now is called the Empirical Educator Project. And that was very mindfully named, right? We're not going to change higher ed or corporate learning, for that matter, by bringing in new software or instituting new practices. It has to be a cultural change. And that brings me actually to some comments that I really enjoyed from Julie about data. And we have a misconception about data too. We tend to think about data as magic fairy dust. It's undifferentiated, but the more you have of it, the more magic there will be. And what we found over decades of building these systems, whether you're using a corporate, standard like SCORM, or you're using one of the IMS more academic oriented standards, is that we're gathering a lot of data that doesn't really tell us a whole lot about what kind of learning's going on, right? We know what they're clicking on. We maybe can figure out if they've got a good chance of passing. We know maybe if they're paying attention. We don't know anything about their learning. Two principles of learning, one articulated by the great Herb Simon is that students learn by what they think and do, and only by what they think and do, right? And so what that means is that as educators, we're trying to provoke them certain thoughts and actions that will lead the learners to learn. Now, you can't be learned. It's not a passive verb. It doesn't work that way, right? But the other part of that is learning is invisible. So we can't see someone learning. We can't see what they've learned. So part of your design challenge is also to construct activities in which what the learner has learned is visible to themselves, to you, to the manager or the department head, and to the software that's trying to analyze all of this, right? So, those principles, you're designing these learning feedback loops that need to provoke learning and make evidence of that learning or lack of learning visible, right? If you don't encode pedagogical intent into the deep structure of your learning platforms, if you add it as an afterthought, you'll never get any useful data. And you need those useful data, not just to draw new inferences, but to build that culture. The two go hand in hand. If you're just giving them crap about, well, the students logged in this many times, you're not going to get your educators to engage with, well, are they really learning what I think they're learning, and what I'm doing effective? So I think that the literacy and culture driven into the deep structure of our fabric of our organizations and the fabric of our software design, those are the keys.
Can I add on to that real quick? Is that okay?
Sure.
I jump in, sorry. But speaking to what you're saying, Michael, about the culture and kind of building that in, when we're talking about higher ed, particularly research institutions, there is, and this, I saw this in my doctoral research, faculty are kind of on board with ideas of using both qualitative and quantitative, holistic type, evaluation of their courses and things like that. But they're not typically willing to actually go and make any informed changes from that unless they're incentivized, meaning like how they're evaluated, right? So how are they being evaluated for promotion and tenure and that sort of thing? And so unless those types of structural changes are kind of discussed as well, you're not likely to get much traction. And even if you have a whole learning design unit that is on board and revving to go and has the data in their hands, they can't implement it without the faculty, right? In terms of COVID, since we're kind of talking about that too, I do think that en masse, the faculty are realizing how much work and effort goes into online, which we've all known this for a really long time, but that's also prompting discussions, I think, with leadership and administration and how that might shape promotion and tenure and those types of policies. So just wanted to add to that. Thanks.
I'm very glad you brought that up, because one of the things we haven't mentioned in this conversation is the incentive systems and how they shape what we do and what we don't do. But I'm just gonna leave it at that and jump into Laura's response to the question.
Yeah, so it's interesting when it comes to learning in corporate. It's almost like the L&D department becomes McDonald's. It's, if you're a stakeholder and you have money, you go to L&D and say, I want this, and you serve that back to them. And that conversation, it needs to shift. And that's where we're trying to encourage our clients to become more data-driven, so that they're not in a position where they're simply saying yes to everything because there's money on the table and somebody yells the loudest. It's actually looking at what does the audience actually need? How do you match it against the KPIs of the business? Simple things, for example, looking at search terms. We do that with every single client. And your top 10 search terms, you look at those on a daily basis. That will tell you what people need. And I mean, these are very dynamic environments. Like we work, for example, with Novartis as one of our clients, some of the banks with their call centers. That's really telling you what is bubbling up. Can we use data to, look to aggregate, performance reviews and goal settings? Are we aligned against the business KPIs, or has something gone horribly wrong and everyone wants to learn agile and we're not an agile project management company? So it's using data in a different way to challenge those conversations. The other problem though is and this is where it gets into, and I don't want to make it sound negative because we are trying to change it and fight this, but a lot of the C-suite does not know what they can expect from their L&D department other than delivering compliance, leadership training. Those are the two that they're looking for. And we're saying, no, you don't just want to know the numbers of hours that somebody spent, and you certainly don't want to be increasing your hours. That's a big one where they're like, everyone should do 100 hours of learning a year. Well, no, the idea that's not doing anything if you increase from 50 to 100. I can watch Netflix for twice as long, and that doesn't do anything. But it's about getting them to understand what metrics they really should be looking at, which is, to Michael's point, evidence of transfer. Are we seeing the KPIs being met, and how did we enable that environment, and not just tasking learning with things that, learning, we're going to want you to do a course to change our culture. Well, no, I mean, unless you're going to change the policies, you're going to change HR, you're going to change how you deal with problem, offenders at your company, all of those things. Us doing a course on culture is really not going to contribute to that. So data, it becomes almost what I like to call a superpower when you really want to become a lean and efficient machine doing the right things for that learner at the other end who they need to stay relevant or be made redundant. So last thing too, I'll just say about, we've talked about linking skills with pipeline and whatnot. This is something that every company right now is struggling with. There are deep skills deserts that employers are starting to realize that they simply can't go to the market and recruit these people. They don't exist. So the companies who are going to be able to get recruiting or to get reskilling, or I call it right skilling, right for their organizations are the ones who are going to weather this recession the best. And that is a real struggle. So they have to think of skills development almost like supply chain management, whereas previously it was, oh, take what you want. We have this LXP and you're going to have fun and you're going to take this course. And what does everyone do? They all take leadership. And do you need 80% of your workforce to be leaders? Maybe you do. Maybe you also need Ruby on Rails, or maybe you also need agile project management, as I mentioned before. So you have to think far more strategically. Once you're bringing that data into the conversation, it really does elevate you from being just the McDonald's to becoming a strategic business advisor.
Excellent. And a very good roadmap, I think, to going forward. And I love the phrase skill deserts. I'm going to start using that in conversations. All right, sorry, I'm going to turn the questioning back over to Kim for the final round of questions.
Great. Thanks everyone. I love these kinds of panels because I'm just learning so much myself, and that is one of the joys of facilitating this class, is that I learn as much, hopefully, as the learners do as well. Anyway, the next round of questions that we're going into are around ID, and Julie, I'm going to be leaning very heavily on you for this round of questions, and also Jennifer, I'd like to loop you into this first one. Our learners have been spending some time looking at learning theories this semester, adult learning theories, constructivism, behaviorism, humanism, cognitivism. And they've been building lessons that evoke each of these particular theories. And so there's a question from the learners, having spent probably about, 6 to 7 weeks in design labs doing this. How do you blend the different learning theories that have been the pillars in this class? What what do you take into consideration, or what do you advise professionals to take into consideration? And personally, are you drawn to one theory that you think is more useful than another? So Julie, can I go to you first?
Sure.
For this one?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because when Lori was talking about, kind of coming out and clutching our theories in our hands and stuff, I think you referenced, Bloom's taxonomy and Gagne and stuff, which I learned about and, have lots of love for. But at the same time, those are kind of old at this point. I mean, not that they're bad, but there's a lot of questions that they don't answer. I got really interested in game design about 10, 15 years ago because I think game designers know a lot more about bringing people along a skill curve than any instructional designer I know. Right. And it was never about fun. Like, games are fun and I like them and that's great. But the idea of how do you take somebody from, along a skill curve and actually ramp them up gradually over time and really design for that, that's a thing that I think, that's actually a problem I'm still working on for myself in terms of what are some good mechanisms for doing that. So I would say that I don't have any strong adherence to any particular learning theory. I've got a lot of love for a good constructivist, problem-based learning environment and some of those kinds of things. But I also see a lot of benefit to, behaviorism, or the way that we think about cognitivism and cognitive load, and all of these different things. So I think it's more about being able to actually do something with all of these tool sets and do it. And one of the things that I see a lot on the corporate side is an over adherence to a few frameworks because it makes you feel like a professional. And what Lori was talking about, which is this sort of order taker mentality, one of the issues, and it was going to what I was saying before, was one of the big issues is we don't have a lot of evidence about what we do being effective or not effective. And that creates a pretty deep insecurity in the field, where you're sort of just adhering. I'm like, I learned about Bloom's taxonomy and I know I can't put understand in my learning objectives. But when we're kind of clinging to a few of those things to establish ourselves as professionals, that's a really insecure place to be. And so I'd really love to see, I'm super interested in, I'm going to totally go off and read up about empirical educators, because I do think that one of the really core skills is the ability to kind of set something up as an experiment and test the results. Because all of the learning theory, I've spent a lot of time in the behavioral sciences, and there's a good new book on that, like designing for behavior change. Stephen Wendell just did a second edition, and he's very good. And he talks about the fact that all the theory in the world just gets you to a starting point that you test with your audience. So you can say, I'm going to use this cognitive bias theory and these things over here and this framework and all this kind of stuff. But all it does, because the world is too complex, is gives me a decent hypothesis to begin with. But then I test that hypothesis with my audience and I find out what works and what doesn't work. And so that crucial piece of it, which is the ability to test an idea and find out, is it doing the thing that I want it to do, is frequently missing from our professional practice. And I'll admit it, I struggle with that sometimes too. But what can we do to crack the door open and get a little bit more feedback on, this is a really interesting theory, but does it actually work with my audience? And does it work with this content? And does it make sense? And is it getting the result that I want it to get before I roll it out to 22,000 nurses and make them all take this training and things like that? So
that empathy-based learner perspective, learning design. Yeah, absolutely.
Would it be all right if I just jumped in for a second
Oh,
here?
please do, Michael. Yes.
Yeah, so two quick points. First, I was a philosophy major in college, and what I learned in philosophy of science is it's not a theory if you can't prove it false. If it's not falsifiable, it's not really a theory. It's a philosophy. And that's what the difference is between philosophy and science. Okay, so, and I study philosophy. I have a great affection for it. Constructivism is not a theory. It's a philosophy. Behaviorism is a theory, and it was decisively demolished in one essay by Noam Chomsky in 1957. I highly recommend that everybody read it, right? All of these things that we call theories in education, and on my other hobby horse is, as speaking as a former 8th grade teacher, I think that andragogy and the whole field of adult learning, frankly, was created in the first place by people who wanted to be taken seriously about teaching people in the workplace, but were afraid of the stigma of being an education professor. Look, that's just life, and that was 20, 30 years ago. So just to build on the point that was just made, like, theory, don't worry about your theory. You start with the philosophy, that's fine. Worry about your hypothesis. What do you think is going to work with these students? How do you test it? And how can you know if you're wrong?
Fabulous, Michael. Thank you. Jennifer, would you like to respond?
Sure. So I think lately a buzzword a lot, and it's a good buzzword, but you know, we focus a lot on trying to implement authentic assessments. So that's definitely, I think, in higher ed, something that we're seeing a lot more of, especially from COVID, because a lot of faculty have found that they haven't been able to implement like a traditional paper test, and we're having issues with proctoring, right? So how can we, you know, have a rigorous assessment that still, you know, has some flexibility there, but a unique stamp, you know, from the student perspective of this is their work and it's meaningful to the student. But in terms of the learning theory side of it, I think, because I opened with the buzzword mention of that, is that there is a tendency to, I think, sometimes for instructional designers to want to make everything an authentic assessment. And so while I think that is meaningful, I think in practice, instructional designers need to be really mindful of not just the course that you're working on, but how it fits within the larger curriculum for a program, because it could be that in some courses, you know, a multiple choice test might actually be just fine, you know, and then as we move up, you know, implementing those more hands-on types of assessments and activities. But within a course, I think, and we're talking about learning experience design too, we want to make that ecosystem of the course and the path that the student is moving through, the learner is moving through, if we can draw on any kind of visual cues, right? So being mindful of your color scheme that you use within a course and being consistent and those types of things, you know, whether that means you create a certain kind of call out box and there's some sort of nudge there that indicates to the student that, hey, this is a key takeaway from this part of the module in this course. And so those are some really creative ways, I think, to kind of weave in some of these nudging and theory side of, you know, creating a schema of this goes with this, and I know this is supposed to connect with this. It kind of prompts the learner to connect the dots there. So definitely, I think incorporating some sort of practice to, obviously, before they get to the larger summative assessment, that's really important. And so we're looking at a lot of different tools now that can help with like adaptive learning type tools, and so that it's not just a one-time practice. There are different scenarios that they can play out and still be able to learn multiple times. So, so yeah, I'll end with that.
I love the connection though that you're making. Particularly, we're designing a new learning experience design master's degree, and we have a lot of folks that are very grounded in what's the difference between instructional design and learning experience design. And there's that whole discussion of we're designing the experience of which the instruction is part of it. And so I loved when you were talking about the interface and the nudges and how something might be a different color and all of that. So Jennifer, thank you. I might be knocking on your door a little bit. So anyway, our next question, well, we actually have two more tonight, two more questions, and we'll be wrapping up. And again, this panel has been amazing, and thank you as we're getting toward the end. I'm going to tap Allison and Julie around best practices for building trust with stakeholders and developing collaborative relationship, especially in those traditional environments where maybe next gen teaching is new. Allison, some thoughts perhaps on that from your perspective?
Yeah, so building trust is so important in that design process, and it really stems from honesty and being willing to acknowledge what exists, what people are feeling, what people are thinking, what people need, and acknowledging where existing systems are failing them and where those traditions are holding us back from moving forward. And so a large part of as we're establishing trust and connection with our communities is acknowledging the grief process, especially during this time, because it's not something people really think about. It's just, oh, I'm having all these, feelings. But really, in shifting and COVID and what's happening in society and all those things have really amplified things this year. But even in, the best of times, integrating technology and kind of making those shifts, it's acknowledging that your way of life has died a little bit in a little way, and that's okay to have feelings about that, and to have those highs and lows. And so much of our community, that de-escalation, that connection process is made just through the recognition of that, and going back to those skills that you really need as you go into the field to be successful, is just the ability to step back from the theories and the process and the systems and just be a human and look somebody in the eye and make that connection, even if it's through the screen, is so important to establishing that trust, because it's letting them know, I'm not here from leadership or corporate, I'm here to help you get to that next level where you need to go, and we can do this together. So we talk a lot about collaborative thought partnership, which I know sounds jargony, but it's really, that's what it is. You're collaborating with them, and that helps to build that trust that we're in this together.
Yeah, we're going to walk alongside each other, which is,
yes,
is amazing. Thank you so much in that. Julie, do you have some additional thoughts on that topic in terms of what you would advise?
Yeah, I mean, when we're working with people with a lot of expertise, one of the ideas behind that is that the value that we're getting from them is just sort of pulling a bunch of information out of their heads. And I'm less interested in that because that sort of exists in a lot of places. And I'm more interested in the process that they went about to get that expertise. And Michael was talking before about like some of these fundamental underlying assumptions about the tech, like what the technology is supporting, and that you have to build those things in. Almost, I think it's a little bit worse on the corporate side, but almost all educational technology is built on the idea that the fundamental unit of learning is a piece of information. And you know, as you start to talk about things like learning experience design and so forth, that's a really nice opportunity to kind of break that idea, right? Because the information is not our problem. You know, we've had textbooks for millennia, and we have ways of communicating the information. And sure, YouTube is, you know, a new medium for that. But the other pieces of it, the other ways that you work around that experiment, like if so, you know, one of my little personal thought experiments is if we thought the basic unit of learning was, say, like a learner action with feedback, how would our learning technology look different? I had a really interesting conversation with somebody the other day about expos at conferences. I go to a lot of conferences. You know, we've all sort of always been like, well, online conferences, they're nice because they're easy to get to and it's cheaper, but they don't have the same like social interaction that a live conference does, right? And now that the online conferences are the only ones we have, we're realizing, oh, how do we get some of these other things? And, you know, expos are a big way that you fund conferences because people pay for booths and things like that. And they have these virtual expos, but the virtual expo has the experience of you can't like browse past. You basically have to walk into the booth and announce your presence. It's the online equivalent of like walking right up to somebody and saying, hi, I want to totally engage with you, salesperson. And we were talking about, well, there's way other levels when you actually walk around a physical conference. You want to like skim for stuff. You want to avoid eye contact if you don't want to talk to this person. And there's no way to do that in this online world. And I don't care that much about expos, but it is an interesting thing to say, oh, there were all these other experiences when we did it live, and we're not supporting those experiences in any of our technology for online versions. And there's way more important things than expo halls to worry about when we think about learning experiences, but being able to kind of point to, oh, I used to be able to chit chat with people before class started. And that was, you know, that had some value. Where is that happening in our online environment? Or I used to be able to, you know, raise my hand in class and ask questions. You know, theoretically that's supported in this online environment, but actually it's really awkward and weird. And, you know, I don't feel comfortable doing it in the same way that I did in a live environment, you know, or whatever those things are, but start to really kind of look at that, because we have a vast amount of information delivery technology. You know, like I'm not worried about Udemy that much, because quite frankly, Udemy is a content delivery system by and large. You know, and so it's not going to substitute for a lot of other things soon. But we do need to figure out how to get better at all of this.
Thanks so much, Julie. All right, so we have one question left, and you know that there had to be a tech question, future of technology. And but the unfair part is we've got about 7 minutes to address it. We could probably spend a good half hour you know, in this space, but and I am going to, if each of you can try to, and it's tough, just a couple of minutes. I'd love to go to Michael, Lori, and Julie on this question. You know, our instructional methods are really rapidly evolved and improved, but the technology platforms are potentially being outpaced. And so in your mind, what future trends in technology might better meet the post-COVID instructional landscape? We've had Donald Clark, who's amazing thought leader in artificial intelligence, join the class this semester. You know, we've had experts on gamification. Are there ideas on where technology might develop to make learning a more immersive and engaging experience from your perspective? You know, the LXP versus the LMS, AI, gaming, learning analytics. Lori, let me go to you first.
So I'll touch on one. There's dozens of different things that I do think that we will start seeing in EdTech, but I think the one, and then again, this is from a corporate lens, so this is the way that I'm seeing from here, is really the concept of the invisible LMS, where you are not actually going to a destination, so that the content and the experiences are occurring in the place where you're already working, and your ability to collaborate with people and to you know, synthesize and analyze that is happening happening within the same tools that you would use day to day. And that's going to mean a different way of designing. It's going to be a different way of rethinking of what that learning experience looks like. And I do love the term learning experience designer because I see that really fitting in quite nicely to it. If you want to understand what some of these tools look like, and I'm not endorsing any of them, just saying that they're out there. One of them is called Sparks. So it's withsparks.com. There's also one by a company called Loop with 3 O's, L-O-O-P. I will put that in the chat pod. But these are technologies that are starting to brew, and they're actually sitting now on top of some LXPs and eliminating the need for anybody even to start to log into those. So it's really fascinating. But again, there are dozens. That's just one that I think should be on your radar.
Awesome, Lori. Thank you. Thank you so much. Julie, I'm going to go to you next, and then Michael, I'm going to let you have the last word.
Yeah, so the thing that I'd like this is starting to happen a bit, and I'd like to see more of it, is a little bit less of a, kind of a fetish for educational technology. It's technology, and we have a tendency to build our own when there's a lot of other stuff out in the world that we could be making good use of. So I've been doing a lot of like virtual movie nights, and there's a whole bunch of functionality in Facebook Messenger that does not exist in, things for like, reacting to different things and stuff like that. And it's, and I'm not trying to sell Facebook, I promise, but nonetheless, like there are way better there are way better tools out there for, say, having a conversation about something than usually typically the threaded discussion stuff that lives in educational technology. So why are we recreating all of these wheels? Why can't we, get better integration between existing things so that we're using the best version of a particular thing for a particular task? So yeah, because things like, I think there was a little bit of a mention of kind of community development and that feeling. Like I'm the world's most reluctant community manager, and yet I seem to find myself doing it. And I think that there's a lot of those kinds of things, but there are better tools than the ones that are necessarily floating around in educational technology. So if we can do more integration with that, I think that that's an interesting and promising thing. Although I think that still loops back into some of the stuff that Lori was talking about around data privacy and stuff like that. That's not a universal good. It's a bit of a fraught trade-off, as much technology is. So
Amazing. Oh, thanks. Thank you, Julie. Great thoughts. And Michael, you get the last word tonight. Our learners are here for another few minutes, and so we'd love to get your take on this question.
Well, I guess there are 3 things I would point out. One is just, look, we found so many potholes in our technology integration in the last 12 months, or at least, we've realized how bad they are. In some cases, we knew they were there and we just live with them. So that's a I don't want to say easy, but obvious change. 2, we are learning a lot about synchronous and the blend between synchronous and asynchronous. I mean, is Slack a synchronous or an asynchronous platform? I don't know. I mean, in recent months, we've had education-specific platforms like Engagely, and a tool that is not education-specific that I've been using for conversations lately called Run the World. I think we're going to see a lot more out there. But I think the one I'm most excited about is the one that Julie actually described 2 answers ago, which is we need our educational platforms to be fundamentally structured on the idea that an educational experience, whether it's a single multiple choice question or it's an entire degree curriculum, is a feedback loop or a series of nested feedback loops. It's a student experience, it's the output, and it's the way we react, the student and educator react to that output. We need to design for that pedagogical intent. We need the execution logic of the software and the analytics that capture that pedagogical intent to be one and the same. And I'm very excited to tell you that we are in the process of building that right now. I blogged about it a little bit recently about the open source, open standards effort of a collaboration between Carnegie Mellon University and ASU. There'll be more. I'll be writing about that soon. That's actually a collaboration fostered under the facilitation of the Empirical Educator Project. All that really means is that I got some smart people together in a room and encouraged them to talk about something. But I'm very excited about creating a fabric of data that is pedagogically meaningful, that stretches across all these learning experiences. And I think the moment has arrived when we can do that.
Well, everyone, you may not have heard it here first, but definitely a preview of something wonderful coming from Michael and his team. Is that out there? Are we among the first to hear about this, or?
So I wrote about the collaboration between the two universities in the last month. I haven't really described the functional approach that I just articulated to you. I'm going to be writing about that in the next week and putting that out there. But it's work that's been evolving over the last year, and it has its roots in work that has happened both at Carnegie Mellon under the Simon Initiative and at in ASU under the ETX, gosh, I forget what ETX stands for, but they do really cool experiential learning stuff. So really it's a union of those great minds who should have known each other but didn't. And there's really exciting work that's coming out of it.
Congratulations, Michael, on bringing those folks together. And we did hear this piece here first tonight. So thank you for sharing that with us. And everyone, I know we're wrapping up, but just fabulous learnings here tonight. And again, the generosity that I have found amongst our community in terms of sharing knowledge and supporting each other in these very difficult times has been absolutely amazing. The fact that we've been able to bring together this panel tonight, and these folks made time for us. And I'm sure you have many things pulling at your schedules these days, is so amazing. So thank you to our panel. Thank you to our students who put together these questions. And I'd like to wish you all the very best. These are our last moments of the class. We've been together for 16 weeks, and I want to thank each and every one of you. This is a difficult semester for people to persist in a class like this, and each and every one of you is to be congratulated on your persistence, your grit, and your dedication to make the world a better place. Peter, you have any final words?
I'd like to say that this is the graduate seminar I always wanted, but I never got. And it only took me 27 years of careful planning to bring it about. So I now have closure. Again, I want to reiterate what Kim said, the immense gratitude for all of you. You know, we basically did what Michael's done with the Empirical Project, which is bring a lot of smart people together into a room and have them talk to us and to one another. I got one question from students to the panelists. If any of you are open to having any of our students reach out to you via LinkedIn, please just let us know in the chat. We'd be happy, because again, you know, you've got them hooked and they really want to be interested in an ongoing conversation. And I'll add one more thing, which is that, one of the things I expressed at the top of our session was that I'm really hopeful going forward there are more conversations between people doing this work in the workplace and in academia, because I think the paradigm shift we're seeing, it really requires a breaking down of that is the last great silo of learning, and we really need to bring the walls down. And I'll just end on my gratitude.
Such gratitude, and thank you to our panelists for being our parting gift to this very special cohort of learners. So good night, everybody. Stay safe, and all the very best.
Thank you so much. Bye.